Thanks, and thank you for coming out today. I know there's a lot going on campus, so I really appreciate you being here. It's a small, mighty crowd, right? So if you would have told my 20-year-old self that one day I would be giving a talk about ways of studying and understanding history, I would have laughed. I was not the kid who loved history class, you know, the types, the ones that memorize names and dates like they're reading from a teleprompter. I was the kid who was busy organizing concerts and thinking about the next Amnesty International meeting that I was going to. So I wasn't cataloging historical events, but I was cataloging indie bands. And those organizational skills served me well in my future profession. My undergraduate degree was in arts administration, and my goal initially was actually to work in theater management, but I wanted to be the person behind the curtain, not the person on the stage. So of course, here I am on the stage. And at the time, my plans seemed pretty straightforward. Manage creative people, balance budgets, keep the lights on, simple enough. But as happens with many of our career paths that we set out for ourselves, mine didn't follow the script that I had written. And sometimes, honestly, the most meaningful relationships happen by accident. So somewhere along the line, I realized that objects, so the things that we make, use, and keep, are not just evidence of history, they're agents of it. They tell stories about who we were and who we want to be. And honestly, that realization changed everything for me. And this is what I want to explore with you today, the idea that material culture, images and objects that surround us, offer powerful pathways to both understanding and disruption. Images do more than just illustrate the past. They construct it. They shape what's remembered, what's forgotten, and how people and communities understand themselves in the world. And through this lens, for me, history becomes alive, it becomes complex, and it becomes deeply human, revealing meaning where we least expect it. So that's where I want to begin this accidental love story, with a question that's guided most of my professional work. What happens when we stop reading history in books, which is the primary way that I learned history early on, and what if we start seeing it in things? Now, don't get me wrong, if you've been to my office, you know that I love books, but what I started to realize is that studying things is an equally important way of understanding both where we've been and how we see ourselves now. So how did I get here? So my first job out of college was actually not in a theater, but in a Dubuque, Iowa jail, which, as you can imagine, was not the career path that my parents had chosen for me. But before you start thinking of orange jumpsuits and license plate presses, let me clarify. It was an Egyptian revival jail built in 1858. It was a National Historic Landmark, one of only 3 Egyptian revival buildings in the country. It had 18-inch thick limestone walls, had beautiful lotus decorations on the cornices, and yes, it had cell blocks that initially held Confederate Civil War prisoners. And here you see photos of the cell blocks before this building was turned into a museum. The image on the left was actually eventually the main gallery area. And then the image on the right was the dungeon, which never really was renovated. So that was in the basement of the building. And I always wondered who in 1858 thought that the Egyptian revival style would be great for incarceration. Which is actually, now I know that there's a long story there, but that would be a whole another talk, I think. So after its life as a prison, this building came to house the Dubuque Museum of Art, where I learned a great deal about how museums work, mostly by doing everything, as you do in small museums. So I cooked for exhibition openings, I transported art in rented U-Haul vans to places like Georgia and Florida. And when I first started working there, I started just as an administrative assistant. So I was part event planner, I was part fundraiser, copy repair technician, and I did that for about a year, and then I shifted into curation. And eventually, because small museums are magical this way, I became interim director. And the shows at the museum ranged from exhibitions of local artists to regionally significant exhibitions to shows like The Spirit of Africa, which was an exhibition featuring masks and sculptures that were on loan from a collector in Iowa. And we also had shows like John Deere from Main Street to Wall Street, which showcased the visual history of, yes, the tractor company, John Deere. And because this was Iowa, we thought, why not go big? And so we borrowed a few John Deere tractors and put them on the lawn of the museum, kind of like big sculptural objects. And suddenly, not surprisingly, we had more visitors than ever. And at first, I found this kind of funny, the juxtaposition of farm implements, farm equipment in with a fine art museum. But the longer the show was up, the more I realized that what these tractors represented. To many in this rural Dubuque community, they weren't just machines. They were pride, they were labor, and they were identity showcased in material form. So really, this John Deere exhibition, strange as it might seem, became my first lesson in how everyday objects hold meaning far beyond their function. A tractor isn't just a tractor. It's a story about work, it's a story about technology and belonging, about who we think we are and how we want others to see us. But to be perfectly honest, I only started to understand this at this time. Back then, I thought my job was to manage things, to make sure that the wall labels were straight and the lighting was good, and to make sure, of course, that no one climbed on the tractors. And even when I moved into more of a curatorial position, I was really acting as a preparator, to use a museum term. I was engaging with the technical aspects of putting up an exhibition, but not really understanding a curator's significant role in helping to shape understanding through interpretation. So I was engaging with the objects, but not necessarily the ideas. But all this said, those experiences, the African masks in a jail, the tractor on the lawn, they started to plant seeds for me. They made me wonder what stories are associated with the things we often overlook. And they also made me think about context and consent. So what happens when sacred objects like African masks travel? And what do institutions take responsibility, or how do institutions take responsibility for framing what we see in an ethical manner? And I wouldn't have used this language back then, but that was the moment that I really began to understand that people and communities construct identity through our material and visual culture. What we choose to put behind glass or park on the front lawn is one way that we reveal who we are and what we value. So after a number of years in Dubuque, my partner decided that he wanted to go back to graduate school. So we packed up our things and moved north to Madison, Wisconsin, which people lovingly refer to as the Berkeley of the Midwest. And after a short stint working as the manager at a frame shop, I started working at the Madison Children's Museum. And if you've never worked at a children's museum before, which not many people have, let me tell you, it's a place where chaos and creativity share a common mailing address. And even though I was technically on the administrative side of things, I learned a lot about non-toxic cleaning supplies, what materials make the best fake dinosaur bones. And I also learned that no matter how hard you try, children's museums are just breeding grounds for germs. I think I spent the whole first year that I worked at the Children's Museum sick, and I think my immune system just said, you're on your own. So the museum was up the street from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I decided that on my lunch break, I would take an art history class. And this was somewhat on a whim, but I just thought it would be a nice break from my accounting duties. And that class really changed things for me. As an undergrad, I'd taken a couple art history classes, and they'd all been about memorization. So names, titles, dates, you felt like you were preparing for a Jeopardy, being on Jeopardy. But these classes were really different. We weren't studying art as isolated masterpieces. We were studying how the things people make reflect their lives, their beliefs, their fears, their dreams, their hopes, and it was truly a revelation for me. I suddenly realized that history through objects wasn't just about dates and battles, it was about people, how they navigate their daily lives, and how those lives are written into our material world. So I continued taking classes on my lunch break until I finally applied to graduate school at the encouragement of one of my future mentors, Anne Smart Martin, who asked, kind of only half jokingly, if I planned to join the department or if I was just going to haunt them forever. So when I first started graduate school, my intent was to study material culture. So things like gas stations, vernacular buildings, furniture, ceramics, and, of course, toasters. And the art history classes at the University of Wisconsin-Madison were in the basement of the Chazen Museum of Art. And we had the great privilege of working with amazing objects from a variety of different places, spanning many, many different years. So with all of this at my disposal, my first graduate school project was, you might guess it, about chamber pots. Working with some of my graduate school colleagues, we organized an exhibition of chamber pots, and the pots dated from about 1450 to about 1940. So some of them pretty old chamber pots. Some were kind of simple, like this. Some were hand-painted with very decorative floral arrangements. Some had witty sayings on them. They varied quite a bit. But all of these pots spoke volumes about things like cleanliness, privacy, gender, and class, and they raised a number of important issues for me. So who had access to indoor facilities? Who emptied the pots? What did clean even mean for the places that these pots were being produced? So these chamber pots really came to engage an entire social order. And that's when I began to realize that even the most mundane objects can reveal and also reinforce ideology and power structures. These objects weren't just reflecting cultural assumptions and patterns, they were reinforcing these cultural assumptions and patterns. So in hindsight, it's kind of ironic that about the same time that I was working on this chamber pot project, that I started working with the Kohler Foundation. And yes, this is the Kohler Foundation, associated with Kohler Company, who does sinks and faucets and toilets. And I think there seems to be a theme here with my early professional career. But for those of you that don't know, Kohler Company and the Kohler family are actually huge supporters of the arts. So they subsidize the John Michael Kohler Art Center, which has amazing bathrooms. They have a fellowship for artists where the artists are able to come in and actually work in the factory and use the materials to create things throughout a whole summer, and the Kohler Company puts them up while they're doing this. And then there's the Kohler Foundation. And the Kohler Foundation preserves art by self-taught artists. And the works that they focus on are often these amazing environments that are made from all different kinds of things, often things just found objects around them, things from everyday life. And as the Marie Christine Kohler Fellow for a couple years, I had the opportunity to work with conservators from all over the world on different projects, including at the Mary Knoll House, which you see here. It's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's an amazing place. And it's really a place where art and life are completely integrated. So every aspect of this whole entire house is art. You see it here on the lawn. If we look at the interior, every inch of this house was decorated. And I lived here, had the privilege of living here over the summer. It was right on Lake Michigan, and it was such a profound experience for me. And I started to realize that I kept finding myself drawn to these spaces where creativity is just seeping into every aspect of ordinary life. And looking back at what I did, the John Deere exhibition, the Children's Museum, the chamber pots, and of course the self-taught artists, all of this was training me to see how profoundly people use material and visual culture to make meaning out of the world around them. And I was really hooked. So by this point, I was deep into my relationship with history. We were well past just the getting to know you phase. But as my research evolved, my interest started to shift from material culture to what's called visual culture. So if material culture is about things, the objects that you can hold, visual culture focuses on both the way people literally see and then the visual world around us. So this isn't just art in a museum, it's propaganda, it's Instagram feeds, and it's children's art, an example of which you see here. And that shift really kind of blew my world open, because I suddenly realized that everything around us is telling a story about who we are and what we value. We just have to learn how to read it and embrace the fact that there are different ways of seeing. And some of you might know the phrase ways of seeing if you've studied visual culture, and it's incorporated into the title of my talk. It's a phrase that comes from British critic and art historian John Berger. And when I first encountered this book, Ways of Seeing, it was actually already considered old school. It was written in 1972, long before social media or AI. But it laid the groundwork for subsequent thinking about the various ways that images work in our society. And what struck me about what Berger was talking about is that he wasn't just talking about art, he was talking about power. So his argument was that seeing is not neutral, that our vision, the way we see through our eyes, is actually shaped by ideology, culture, and experience. That what we look at and how we're taught to look reflects who has the power to define things like beauty, success, and even truth. And maybe most importantly, what he taught me is that visual literacy matters, that we can and should question what we see and how it's shown to us. And that simple idea that learning to see critically completely reshaped how I was thinking about my project and how I was understanding history. Images don't just show us the world, they make the world. They build our sense of what's real, what's possible, and who gets to be visible within it. And this realization guided my PhD dissertation, which was eventually published by Routledge as a part of their Art and Politics series. This project, A New Deal for Design, explores the visual culture of the Great Depression, and more specifically, posters created through the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, in the United States during the kind of later 1930s, very early 1940s. And these were government-funded posters that promoted everything from national parks and public health campaigns to adult education. And many of them are bright, they're modern, they're optimistic. We see smiling hikers, we see these beautiful mountain areas, and we see happy workers. They were designed to lift people's spirits during one of the darkest economic times in US history. But looking at the breadth of these tells us actually a really complicated story about a nation trying to rebuild. More specifically, they show us how the federal government used visual culture to communicate values like hope, work, progress, and to foster unity within a fractured time through the idea of civic literacy. And as another example of this, conservation was a huge part of the New Deal agenda, and a number of WPA posters were produced or commissioned by the National Park Service and other agencies to promote both recreation and preservation. These posters didn't just encourage Americans to enjoy the outdoors. They told them how to look at it and how to engage responsibly. One of my favorite examples shows a car driving down a dark wooded road at night. Its headlights are catching a doe and a fawn leaping across the road, and underneath we have the text, "Don't kill our wildlife." So it's a striking image, right? We see the sleek geometry of the car, the kind of blue monotone background juxtaposed with the deer. It's also intentionally ambiguous. We wonder, will the driver stop on time? And we don't know what's going to happen next. And this uncertainty is a part of the point of the poster. The text actually invites us to think of ourselves behind the wheel. And in doing so, it suggests that conservation just isn't a government project, it's a personal responsibility. Seeing those deer and stopping in time becomes an ethical act that we all need to be a part of. But posters like this also reveal tensions that defined environmental thinking during the 1930s. A number of New Deal initiatives, as I'm sure you know if you have studied the New Deal, were about building, right? So dams, roads, trails, campgrounds. And a lot of these projects opened up wilderness areas to tourists and cars. And the Park Service wanted people to visit. This was a great recreational activity in a time when money was scarce. But they were also trying to encourage recreation in a way that balanced different ideals, nature as playground and nature as sanctuary. And if we look at a lot of the WPA posters, they show us these stunning untouched landscapes with almost no people. It's rare that we see cars, roads, or evidence of development. They're inviting us to see America, but what they're actually showing us is a very curated version of nature. It's carefully managed, it's cleaned up, and it's framed to look wild. So for me, that's what makes these images so fascinating, how they worked to teach people how to enjoy the landscape without destroying it. And progressive era conservationists referred to this as the wise use of natural resources. So this is really something that is fully embedded into these WPA posters. So Aldo Leopold, who also worked in Madison, Wisconsin, was one of the most important environmental thinkers of the period. And he called this tension that I'm talking about one of the greatest paradoxes of the early 20th century. For Leopold, Outdoor recreation, particularly when it was informed by an understanding of ecology, could lead to a heightened sense of perception and what he called a well-developed mental eye, which he said was essential for understanding nature and then by extension, the need for environmental preservation. But according to Leopold, many Americans were actually driven by a very shallow notion of beauty. So viewing nature through the windshields of their cars or from the verandas of their hotels, they had become, in his words, ecologically colorblind and unable to look beyond the surface of what lay before them. And in the picture on the right here, we see kind of an interesting parallel to the WPA poster, and this was taken from the Pennsylvania Game News, and it was accompanied by a really interesting article that framed this environmental devastation as drama in the wild, particularly as it related to animals. So the WPA posters were very much a part of this conversation, and most of them were trying to encourage an engagement with the environment that was more in line with what Leopold was advocating. So they encouraged a deeper type of seeing, one that required slowing down, getting out of your car and walking through nature, or potentially, as this poster shows, doing it on horseback, and truly seeing what's in the landscape. So these posters, they're not just about encouraging tourism. That was definitely part of it. And they are trying to promote national pride, but they were also visual arguments about how to look at and how to engage with nature. They asked Americans to see the environment not as a backdrop for leisure, but as something that was alive, interdependent, and also vulnerable, encouraging us to acknowledge our own responsibility for ensuring its preservation. So from chamber bots to propaganda like this, I was still engaging with the same question, right? How visual and material worlds help us make sense of our own place as humans and how we navigate this world. So Berger taught me that seeing was political. These WPA posters and artists reinforce the fact that visual culture can be aspirational. And somewhere in the midst of this, I'm learning to kind of find my way among the different ways of seeing. So since finishing my coursework for graduate school, I've had the chance to work with some incredible institutions. I've done contract work for the Kennedy Center, helping them with their very special arts project. And I have had the privilege of 2 Smithsonian year-long fellowships, one as a research fellow, which you see me in the striped skirt here, a very much younger version of myself. I look back at the photo and I'm like, wow, time has definitely passed. And more recently, I was a fellow at the Archives of American Art with a cohort from across the country, of professors across the country, where we were thinking about ways that you can integrate archival materials into your teaching. But what I learned is whether I'm standing in a Smithsonian gallery or a small regional museum, the same question keeps surfacing for me. How do images and objects shape what we believe is true? How do they influence us? And that's a question that's also carried into my teaching. Next semester, I'm teaching a gender and representation course that I teach every other spring. And I always start the semester by looking at a film many of my students are very familiar with. Captain America, the First Avenger. I don't know if any of you have seen this. On the surface, this film is arguably, because there's always a student in the class that hates this film, so arguably very entertaining. There's a lot of action, people have fancy costumes, definitely kind of a quintessential superhero movie. But if we start digging a little deeper into this, we suddenly realize that we're talking about so much more than just a superhero movie. And for those of you that haven't seen this before, Steve Rogers, that we see here, he starts the movie as kind of a frail young man during World War II. So he has a strong moral core, but not much of a six-pack to speak of. And he ends up volunteering for a super soldier program because he wants to do something to contribute to the war effort. So as a part of this super soldier program, he goes through a transformation. He's put into what is referred to as, I believe, the Vita ray chamber, I think is what this is called. And he's given a super soldier serum. And when he emerges, he is this physically powerful specimen. And he's now shown in the film as very muscular, he's bold, he's a leader, and he's extremely active. So now he's grabbing people, he's leaping, he's diving, he's showing in all of these very active poses. But looking closer, I start wondering what this means for us in terms of how it's shaping our understanding of masculinity. So in many ways, the film reinforces a stereotypical and very problematic understanding of masculinity. He is this kind of quintessential ideal soldier hero model. But the film does complicate this quite a bit. Steve's worth isn't just in his muscles or the shield that he carries. It's in his conscience, his willingness to question authority, and his loyalty to people. He models a version of masculinity that includes vulnerability, reflection, and also moral agency, even as he wears the uniform and is muscular and carries the shield. So although it's not maybe the ideal representation of masculinity, if there is such a thing, it's more nuanced than one might initially think. And I always ask my students, why is this type of analysis important? And one reason they come back with is that this movie has massive reach. So Captain America has earned over $370 million worldwide. And when a story has that kind of global impact, the images and ideals that it presents don't just reflect culture, they shape culture. The way Steve Rogers is represented, the way power is shown in these, the way heroism is framed, these become part of a visual vocabulary of masculinity that's reaching millions of people. It teaches us what strength should look like, who should lead, who should protect, and who needs to follow. So these are not neutral interpretations. They're deeply cultural, and they matter. So the same questions that we can ask of blockbuster films, like who is visible, how are they being represented, and who's included in the narrative, are some of the same questions we bring to museums and archives. At the Center of Southwest Studies, where I spend the majority of my time these days, we try hard to frame history not as something that's in the distant past, but as something that plays an important role in shaping our collective memory and shaping our sense of belonging. So we think a lot about how things like photographs and maps, or even exhibition design, can include or exclude, how it can illuminate or how it can obscure. And as an example, two of our most recent exhibitions, they don't just tell stories, they invite people to question who's had the privilege of telling stories in the past. So every day I'm reminded that museums and archives at their core, they aren't just about preservation, they're about participation. They're places where we gather to make meaning together, to reconsider the past, to imagine the future, and to kind of find ourselves somewhere in between those two different places. So at this point in my career, if someone asks what I do, I often reply that I'm a museum director that has studied to be a cultural historian, or sometimes I say I study visual culture, but usually that latter one kind of gets me a smile and this kind of pause, because people don't entirely know what that is. But from the beginning of this talk, we've been touching on a central assumption of that approach, that visuals don't just illustrate history, they construct it. Every image, every object, every design decision we encounter helps to define what counts as truth, whose stories are visible, and whose are pushed to the margins. So it's important, again, to note representation isn't mere decoration or illustration. As we've been discussing, it shapes ideologies and power relations. So the ad that sells us perfection, films that script our heroes, maps that define our borders, and the photographs that tell us what a beautiful mountain landscape looks like, all of these shape our collective imagination. And more than this, when we construct an image, we're also deciding what's excluded from the scene, which raises a number of interesting questions. Who gets pictured? What stories get preserved in museums? And who's left out of the narrative? And the politics of remembering and forgetting are everywhere. And these questions have only become more urgent with AI-generated images that invent realities from scratch, along with things like social media filters that smooth out not just faces, but complexity itself. And here, I actually typed into ChatGPT my role, right? So a professor and museum director giving a presentation on a stage. And this is what came back, which is, I think, really telling. And also kind of, makes me question, makes me stress the need for knowing visual literacy, right? Kind of being aware of what's being presented to us in these images. So we're surrounded by images that challenge a clear distinction between truth and fiction. And this isn't new by any means, but its prevalence, again, has reinforced the need for people to be very visually literate. And yet I'm not cynical about things like this. In the classroom, I see what happens when students start to look critically and approach seeing as a practice. They start to realize that what they thought was just an image is actually a blueprint for how the world works, but also, importantly, how it might work differently. They start noticing the margins, the absences, the powers behind the frame. And once you start seeing this, it's really hard to unsee it. And as I've learned, approaching seeing as a practice, it requires context, it requires conversation, and honestly, a little bit of humility. It means asking, what am I missing when I'm looking at this? And when we do that, in my mind, something extraordinary happens. Seeing differently becomes a radical act. It's an act of challenging what's presented to us as normative and opening the door to other possibilities. So when I look back on my whole journey, from the business major who thought history was just something you had to endure, to the person standing here talking about it, I'm kind of amazed by the trajectory. And I didn't fall in love with history by reading about the grand events in textbooks, or even by looking at artistic masterpieces. I fell in love with it through the ordinary things that somehow carry the weight of who we are. So through tractors and chamber pots, through posters and photographs. And it's been, as the title of my talk suggests, kind of an accidental love affair, one that started when I wasn't even looking for it. And I've seen this happen with my students too. Earlier this year, I got a note from a student that I had in class 5 years ago who actually took gender and representation from me. And he said it was one of the classes that really stuck with him after school. It was his first real exposure to gender theory. And he told me that reading texts like Bell Hook's Oppositional Gaze really kind of encouraged him to see things that he'd never noticed before. And for me, honestly, that's the real payoff. When you start having students, or just really anyone, that moment when they realize that the images we live with, the ones we create, question, share, they aren't just background noise. They shape how we understand the world and also our place in it. So even though this is an accidental love affair for me, one that started with tractors and toilets, it somehow led to so much more. Because when you start paying attention and really paying attention, you realize that the world is full of ways of seeing. And for me, that's the reason to keep looking.